This is lecture 9C. So I've talked for a couple lectures now about setting up the Roman Empire. Now I'm going to knock it all down. So I mentioned that the heyday of the Roman Empire was the first and second century CE, and the sort of maximum extent of the Roman Empire was reached in the early second century CE, the 110s, 120s. And But beginning in the third century, in the 200s, you begin to see problems. You begin to see some things going wrong. And there's a number of things that are happening here. First of all, there are external pressures. For reasons we don't exactly understand, but probably have to do with climate change. You see a series of movements, migrations of people out of the Central Asia, and they begin to push into. You begin to see a sort of domino effect that people start to push out of Central Asia, and that pushes on sort of nomadic peoples next to them who move and push on people next to them, etc. But what you begin to see in the third century is you start to see groups that the Romans called barbarians begin to put pressure on the Roman Empire. What Rome had done is it essentially had when it established its borders, when it conquered a territory, it established borders, it would put up forts, and it would station legions along the borders. But then it would say to the people outside of the empire, you're staying outside, but they would make it palatable for those people by doing certain things. One of the first things they would do is they would say, okay, if there's a barbarian king living just outside of the Roman Empire, they would pay them. They would give them a lot of money, and they would say, okay, I want you to keep people away from our border. And then they would establish trade with those peoples, etc. And so it was worth dealing with the Romans because you could get rich, you could do trade, they give you subsidies, etc. But beginning in the third century, those peoples on the outside of the Roman Empire start getting pressure from people, other groups coming at them from Central Asia, and they start trying to get into the Roman Empire. They start saying, "Hey, we can't hold them off out here. We want to come in. Can you protect us?" etc. And this led to tension, and often the Romans started to feel enormous pressure from what they called barbarian groups coming at them from various points along their Eastern European border. So from Germany, the so-called Germanic tribes of Northern Europe, or the Goths coming in from more what today would be called Ukraine. And so, and in particular in the third century, you start to see more and more invasions, either of people who were formerly friendly, who are now trying to get into the empire for protection, or people who were formerly friendly and decided they had to invade because they had no other choices, or from new groups who had pushed their way in to get to the empire. But this leads to the Roman Empire having to dramatically increase its expenditures on the military, right? They have to start beefing up their military along the borders to stop these invasions. But that means that the Romans have to maintain big standing armies, and they have to pay them, and they have to find people to fill them. And this leads to, and this is a tough transition for the Roman Empire to do, because essentially, under the Roman Republic, the legions were filled with small farmers who basically got drafted for a certain number of years to serve in the legions, and they got paid for it. But to pay for it, the Romans now start increasing taxes, and they're increasing taxes on the same small farmers that they're trying to introduce to make into the soldiers in the legion. And so small farmers start to get seriously crunched because they're both being taken away to serve in the legions, which means that they have a hard time maintaining their farms. Their families have a hard struggle to maintain their small farms, but they're also finding their taxes are being raised, which also means their family is struggling to maintain the small farms. And so you start to see small farmers get seriously under pressure, both because they're being taken into the military and because they're having the tax burden increased enormously to pay for the military. So what you start to see is small farmers going bankrupt and essentially abandoning their farms and moving into cities, and then the government has to pay for them because they have to give them food. They're on the dole in Rome, and so that now the government has to pay to support them, and so the government has to increase taxes on other small farmers. And the real key here is that the patricians, the big landowners, generally don't pay taxes because they've got enough clout in the government to prevent anyone from taxing them. And so the government is basically squeezing small farmers and merchants and trying to squeeze money out of them. And the real money is with the patricians who are not getting taxed. Well, so this leads to a lot of dissatisfaction in the military. That basically soldiers are having, the government starts to struggle to pay all the legions that it has. They're fighting more often, et cetera. And this leads to dissatisfaction in the military. And this leads to the phenomenon known as the barracks emperors. In the 200s, the 3rd century, there's a whole series of military coups where a general out on the border can't pay his troops because the government hasn't paid him. So the troops start to get really angry, and they're mad at their general. He can't pay them. So the general basically says, "Well, you know what? They're gonna kill me right now, or I'm gonna say to my troops, well, let's go to Rome and force them to pay us." And so he turns his army around and he marches on Rome and essentially knocks off the government, makes himself emperor, and then pays his troops. But he has the same problems that the previous emperor had. How does he pay all the military? He has to raise taxes, etc. And the net result is that very soon there's another general marching on Rome to get rid of him, and then another general marching on Rome to get rid of him. And so these so-called barracks emperors are using military power to basically stage coups and take over, but they don't last very long. The average life expectancy for a barracks emperor is about 18 months, right, before you get knocked off by the next one. And so Rome starts to suffer from this period of serious instability in the 200s, in the 3rd century, because you start getting more and more invasions from the outside. You have to beef up the military, but they're struggling to pay for it, and this is causing enormous dissatisfaction in the military, but also it's causing enormous dissatisfaction amongst the small farmers and the general population. Well, things come to a head. Finally, in 284, a general takes over named Diocletian. And Diocletian is a really competent general, and he basically stops the sort of endless turnstile of barracks emperors because he holds on to power for 20 years. And Diocletian does a series of reforms. He basically says, okay, we've got to restructure the Roman Empire to make this work. And so he does a lot of things that are interesting, but most of them dramatically increase the power of the government. First of all, he breaks the Roman Empire into two halves. He says Rome is going to be the capital of a Western Roman Empire, and Constantinople, well, it's not Constantinople, it's Byzantium, is going to be the capital of an Eastern Roman Empire. So he breaks them into two parts, and he basically says, now we're going to have two co-emperors who, one rules the West, one rules the East, and they're going to cooperate with each other. Okay? And Diocletian sets all this up. The second thing is he begins to restructure the tax code and try to get more money out of people, including trying to get some out of the patricians. But he also, because people are running away from their farms and taking off to avoid bankruptcy through taxes, he begins to pass a series of laws that restrict people from moving around, from leaving jobs, etc. He's basically trying to make the government force people to stay where they are so they can tax them, and etc. He also does a series of reforms in the bureaucracy to make it more efficient. And essentially, Diocletian probably saves the Roman Empire for another, 150, 200 years. But he does so at a cost of making the government much more oppressive. Now, Diocletian has one other thing. He decides he wants to have a steady succession of emperors. So he basically says, you've got two co-emperors now. They each rule half of the empire. And then he's going to declare a vice-emperor who is, when the emperor retires, the vice-emperor steps up, and then he names a new vice-emperor. So there's a succession. There's you know who's going to be the next emperor. And so in 305, Diocletian steps down, he retires, and he makes his co-emperor retire, and then he says to the next two, Galerius and Constantine, you guys are now the co-emperors. Well, that works great for like 5 seconds, but Galerius and Constantine immediately get into a civil war that Constantine eventually wins. And I mentioned in the Christianity lecture that just before the final big battle at Milvian Bridge between Constantine and Galerius, Constantine sees a cross in the sky and says, if I win, I'll recognize Christianity. So Constantine inherits Diocletian's reforms, but Constantine actually puts the empire back together. He's the single emperor. But Constantine actually moves to the capital from Rome to Byzantium, and then he renames it Constantinople after himself. And Constantine, because of the reforms that Diocletian has made, Constantine actually runs a pretty tight ship and has a pretty successful empire. And it's his reign is in his reign, the Roman Empire is really powerful. But after Constantine, the Roman Empire would essentially get split. Several times emperors would try to put it back together or split it apart again. It would eventually split permanently. And you would have an Eastern Roman Emperor and a Western Roman Emperor, and they'd talk to each other, and they actually, exchanged money and supported each other and all of that. But they're definitely two completely distinct administrations, pretty much after Constantine. Well, in the 300s and 400s, the number of Roman invasions, not Roman, but barbarian invasions, begins to pick up. And some of the groups moving in are becoming more powerful. They're becoming serious military forces. And so the Romans actually, at this point, they begin to get creative. And so what they do at first is they start to say, when a barbarian force tries to force its way in and the Roman legions defeat them in battle, what they will often say to the defeated barbarians is, why don't you come fight for us? You join the legion, right? We'll either kick you back out or we'll let you stay in the Roman Empire if you join the Roman legions. So the Roman legion starts to incorporate Germanic tribes and other groups, Goths, etc., into their Roman legions. And then later, as the situation gets more desperate, often you'd have the Romans would say to a barbarian commander, he invades and he's roaming around looting things, and the Romans basically confront him and they say, why don't you just take all your guys and we'll make you a Roman legion, right? We'll just hire the whole lot of you and we'll station you at that fortress there and you guard the border and we'll pay you, right? So they're basically buying off the invaders. And then later still, they would even say they would have migrations of whole groups of people with women and children and old people, etc. And they've got a sort of a military force and they're trying to push their way into the Roman Empire. So the Romans would basically say, okay, we've got some territory here that's not really settled, or we got farms that nobody's living there anymore. Why don't you settle there? You take that land and you pay taxes and you serve in the military. So they're basically allowing mass migrations of entire groups by the 300s and 400s. And partly this is a really smart solution to their problem, and partly this is them recognizing they can't stop these groups from coming in anymore. They simply are losing the battle. Well, eventually what happens with the Roman Empire is that the Eastern Roman Empire, the Eastern Mediterranean, from Greece stretching around through Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, through Syria, and then down to Egypt, that's a really wealthy region. It's got high population, it's got a lot of big cities, a lot of trade with the East, with India and Persia and China. It's got a lot of manufacturing, and it's got places like Egypt that are real breadbaskets that are producing enormous amounts of food. So the Eastern Roman Empire is actually pretty wealthy and is doing pretty well at protecting itself. The Western Roman Empire is struggling, though. The Western Roman Empire is far more sparsely populated. France and Spain and North Africa, over Algeria and Morocco, etc., are really not nearly as densely populated as the Eastern Mediterranean. And they don't have the big cities. I mean, Rome is huge, but other than that, the secondary cities, Marseille they're pretty small compared to Athens or Antioch or Alexandria or Constantinople. And so the Western Roman Empire has a lot of border and a lot of territory to defend. It doesn't have a lot of people or a lot of money. And so initially the Eastern Roman Empire is supporting it, but over time the West its situation gets worse and worse because it's facing more and more invasions, and it simply doesn't have the population to put together legions to defend it, and it doesn't have the money, that doesn't have the population to have a tax base to have the money to pay for all this. So essentially, what you get then is the West is really struggling, and eventually the West would be overrun. And by overrun, I mean there's lots of barbarian armies that just push their way into the West, and the West can't stop them, right? Now, I mean, the big example, of course, actually starts in the East, that the Visigoths, a Gothic group, there's a new group of people coming out of Central Asia called the Huns, and they push on the Visigoths. The Goths were actually allies of the Romans, basically, and the Huns start to push on the Goths, and half of the Goths get conquered by the Huns, and half of the Goths push their way into the Roman Empire. And so the Visigoths were the ones who pushed their way into the Roman Empire, and the Romans try to settle them, but conflict breaks out, and the Visigoths actually wind up just going on a tear. They basically go on a raping, pillaging, destroying tour of the Roman Empire. They start in northern Greece, and they plow through Greece, and then they plow up through modern-day Yugoslavia, and then they plow down through Italy, and then they plow across southern France, and they wind up settling down in Spain. And the Romans just can't stop them. The Visigoths are a big enough army that they can't stop them. And then after that, the Huns break in, and the Huns go tearing through. And actually, the Romans have the Visigoths help them stop the Huns. But things are just falling apart in the West, right? In Italy and in France and in Spain, they simply cannot defend against these waves of barbarians coming in. And eventually, and they turn more and more to having barbarians help them defend against other barbarians. And eventually what happens is that a barbarian general named Odovacar strangles the Roman emperor Romulus Augustulus and tries to name himself emperor, but it just leads to the sort of breakdown of the West, and the West essentially falls apart. And the traditional date given for the death of the Western Roman Empire is 476 CE. That's the year that Odovacar strangles Romulus Augustulus. And so in 476, the Western Roman Empire basically ceases to function. But it's not like society falls apart that year. It takes a long time for the Roman government to fall apart completely, because even though the central government isn't there, each province has a provincial governor, and they collect taxes, and they've got, the roads are still there, the trade is still happening, each city has its own mayor, and et cetera. So, I mean, think of it, if the U.S. government, suddenly the president and his whole cabinet are killed, there would be a lot of disruption in the U.S., but each state would still have a governor and a national guard and would continue to function as best they could for a long time, and each city would continue to function. So the West doesn't just fall apart in 476, but the central government essentially stops functioning in 476. But in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire continues to exist. Now, historians give it a different name. I'll talk about that later. It's called the Byzantine Empire. But the Eastern Roman Empire would exist for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. But we'll talk about that in a later lecture. For right now, we can say that by 476, Rome is dead.